Well, hello, everyone. I'm Carrie Munn from Converge. I'm here with my colleagues Kelly Jarvis and Amelia Pape, and we are a group of consultants that are based in the Pacific Northwest, and we work as a network to support the cultivation of impact networks. And today we want to share a little bit about what movement networks are, how the work gets done in a movement network, what makes them effective. These are some questions that were arising out of the work that your coordination team has shared with us that you all have been working on. And we are aware that the steering committee really truly understands that creating a movement network in this context with your early learning coordination plan makes a lot of sense because of the scope and how the expertise to accomplish the goals lives in many different places throughout the state. So we understand that you're already on very solid footing, and we want to make sure that we're aligning language and definitions so that we can have good and productive conversations moving forward. So acknowledging that you've already done quite a bit of work on the charter, our hope is to clarify some aspects of what it looks like to participate and facilitate and collaborate as a movement network in order to generate impact. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to share a few things with you. So is everybody seeing Cultivating an Impact Network? All right, and I will pass to my colleague Amelia to kick us off.
Thanks, Carrie, and hi, everyone. I'm Amelia from Converge, and like Carrie said, we're a network ourselves, so we are no strangers to changing things on the fly, being with emergence. It's actually a big part of network leadership and network practice, so we're living it together. So thank you for being here with us today. So let's get into it. One of the things that I know that you're no strangers to is that the systems that we live in are complex and dynamic and ever-changing. So if you were to illustrate the partners and relationships of those of you that are participating in the ELCP, they might resemble something like this system map, which is a map of community affordable housing. Now, what you're not really supposed to see on this slide is what anything actually says, but what you can probably see is that there are many points of connections, as well as many positive and negative feedback loops. And what it's supposed to do is sort of help you picture the intersecting dynamics at play in a complex system. Other than the words on the page, the other things that aren't necessarily obvious when you look at this are exactly what the issue is, where it begins and ends. There's really no one obvious solution or single leverage point that's going to make all the difference. So a linear, directive, problem-solving approach just doesn't really work in a complex system because the relationships are actually what hold the system in place. So when navigating a complex issue, it requires us to engage it from many angles at once. We have to change our awareness of the system, understand the relationships, and then start to make wiser choices that better serve the whole. So what does this actually mean? How do we navigate these complex systems? What we need is a strategic, coordinated effort that can address the issue from many angles at once and essentially create coherence in the system. This is an effort that connects the various organizations and sectors who touch an issue and then finds ways to support them to do new things together that they couldn't do alone. And this is what we call a network approach to collaboration. And I want to call out the term network because this is a term that is used in many different contexts, but there are lots of different definitions. So when we say network, we mean an impact network, which is a group of people and organizations who are intentionally convened and coordinated to connect and to learn and to take action together on behalf of a shared purpose. So there are learning networks, which focus on connection and learning. There are action networks, which focus on connection, learning, and action. And there are movement networks, which link many other learning and action networks together, creating a sort of network of networks. These are all types of impact networks. And impact networks use proven practices for bringing communities and organizations together to address those complex issues in living systems, the ones that don't have that clear beginning or end, where there's no readily apparent solution. We use a network approach when we can't accurately predict the path ahead because the system itself is made up of interconnected living pieces. that are engaging and learning and evolving in relationship to one another in real time. So how do we actually create change together? In a network approach, leaders and people in the system create connections to build trust between people so that they openly share information, like you all are doing. And then this increases everyone's perspective on relationships within the system and makes it possible to start coordinating the work that's already happening. You start to see those silos break down, duplication of effort reduces, and people are experiencing the benefits of working together. And then over time, coordinating that existing work leads to the emergence of system-wide collaboration that's necessary to create impact at scale. So there's a lot more nuance to this theory of change, but in essence, cultivating an impact network is an ongoing process of connecting, learning and sharing, and taking action together. And one important thing to remember here is that system impact is not predetermined at the outset. Instead, impact networks cultivate the conditions for collaboration to emerge. And together, those collaborations over time lead to those longer-term system impacts. There's a pop-up that I wasn't prepared for, but basically this is describing those conditions. So a healthy network creates conditions that lead to positive intermediate outcomes for participants and later to longer-term system impacts. And that is something that can be measured, which is the basis for network evaluation, which we'll talk about in the future. So taking a network approach is not just necessarily one foot in front of the other. It also requires a sort of mindset shift. And that essential shift is to see ourselves as part of a larger interconnected system of many different actors and organizations. So we're not actually the sun at the center of a solar system, but we can think of ourselves instead as one star in a huge diverse constellation. So rather than putting yourself or even your own organization's mission at the center, network leaders put the shared purpose at the center, that core issue that makes other groups, that many other groups also care about. And then they work to strengthen the connections and flows of information between all those different groups and actors, which is essentially what it means to build a network. This kind of reframe is essential for effective collaboration because purpose becomes a sort of compass that allows participants to orient activities, and the network can stay coherent and organized in order to create a shared future together, even in those ever-changing conditions. Now, this slide is a generic example, but if we were to do this for the ELCP, the purpose that you see at the center would be your purpose, and the constellation of participating organizations would be partners with names you recognize who are implementing alongside one another. Now, in addition to having purpose at the center as a means of orienting the work, how the work actually gets done is also quite different in a network, and something that I think many of you are already living into and experiencing here. So we know that hierarchical structures work well when they're dealing with complicated problems in circumstances that are linear and more predictable and clearly defined. So like launching a satellite or building a bridge, not simple, but not necessarily complex. For a complex situation where the responses of participants in living systems are variable and unpredictable, kind of like raising children or adapting to climate change, organizing as a network becomes more effective. And these mindsets exist on a spectrum, so they're more about what's most useful in a particular situation rather than a strict either or. But to summarize, networks build strong relationships and distribute leadership so they can be adaptive and responsive to emerging needs. And one of the things that we know is important for everyone to understand is what actually makes them effective. One of the things that makes a movement network effective, one of the critical elements of their success, is their ability to develop a culture and practices that are consistent with this kind of mindset shift, or what we call network mindset.
So using that network mindset, this 5-step process called the 5 C's, Converge has been using to cultivate networks. And these are kind of a fractal that can be used in different ways repeated at different scales. And it's I would say fairly proven practice at this point. And the 5 steps go in a cycle. Clarifying purpose and principles is where we begin, because that purpose is at the center. It's the basis of collaboration. And the purpose is what helps people imagine what's possible together that wouldn't be possible alone. And the principles establish ways of working together that people aspire to. So I know that you have participant agreements, and these are one aspect of principles. And the purpose and the principles together at the center is how networks stay coherent and grow, and how participants continue to hold each other accountable over time. So clarifying purpose is an open, inclusive process of collective exploration and a practice that networks revisit and refine over time. So with a clear purpose, then we turn the conversation to convening the people. And networks are bringing diverse members of an ecosystem together for learning, sharing, and action. And every time we come together, we want to be thinking about how to include those who are essential to helping us realize the purpose, especially those who may not be part of the conversation yet. And convenings, when we bring people together to undertake that sharing and learning and action, the convenings must be long enough to cultivate trust. And this is our 3rd C. And cultivating trust is critically important for developing the kind of shared understanding of each other and what we contribute and what we care about and who we are as human beings. And these trusted relationships among people are what make up the fabric of the network. And so to collaborate effectively, people need to know one another. They need to trust each other and their commitment to that shared purpose, so that no one is seen as a stranger. And when we think about what makes us want to collaborate, caring relationships are a much more powerful motivation than issues alone. So once we have cultivated trust and we're learning and sharing, what starts to happen is that people are coordinating their existing work. So everybody is coming from an organization. Typically, that organization is already involved in something in some way that connects them to that purpose. And what we want to do is start amplifying that by coordinating through the connections that are formed, information and resources, and accelerating what we can do and what we're already doing so that we can leverage one another's strengths and support those existing actions within the system. And then we move from coordinating to collaborating for impact. So learning about what's already happening, finding new ways to address challenges. And then when the network is doing this really effectively and seeing the system as a whole, rather than working in limitedly informed silos, members start to synergize, and naturally a kind of collective wisdom arises to the surface and new initiatives emerge that advance the purpose. And then we're back to the beginning with revisiting the purpose and saying, okay, what do we know now? Can we refine the purpose? And we move forward. And as Amelia mentioned earlier, we look at evaluating the network as a means of knowing that our cultivation activities are progressing and the network is healthy. So we say that a healthy network has robust collaborative infrastructure, and these are things like regular meetings, effective coordination, weaving calls between folks, and the kind of collective agreements that we need to be able to collaborate well. We also have in a healthy network participants who have positive experiences engaging with the network. We can measure the connectivity of the participants in our network. So we want to see connectivity that is increasing and the amount of information that's flowing through those connections also increasing. And then what we also want to measure and track is emergent activity. And these are things like new collaborative projects that are coming up, partnerships that are developing among participants that are new. People are doing things together that they weren't doing before. And sometimes those things are happening in the context of the network. Sometimes those things are sparked by the network and they happen on the outside. So each of these domains have corresponding tools for capturing and analyzing data. And that's for another much larger conversation. But now that we've touched on how to cultivate a network and how we assess whether those cultivating activities are leading to network health, we also want to look at network structure. And so some of the questions that we were asked to speak to were, what are movement networks and when are they most needed? So movement networks are intentionally coordinated to leverage synergies across networks. So here you can see in this graphic that we've labeled them regional networks. And these regional networks are useful. A movement network strategy is appropriate when you have a purpose that will be achieved through personal relationships. Implementation is going to vary on the ground because local, community, or environmental differences make a difference, and people will be doing slightly different things. So that customization is an important feature of your strategy. And you have available resources that are sufficient to coordinate and support both a core network and a movement network's coordination. So these participating networks can be organized for action, usually based on geographic regions. Sometimes they're based on issue areas. So different issue areas within the same umbrella of a shared purpose are developed within their own networks. Movement networks coordinate globally and implement locally. And you'll see in the bottom pop-up that each participant network has its own coordination team, has a core team that helps to coordinate within the network the projects that are happening to advance the purpose. And then the core network exists to coordinate and harmonize learning and action across the regional networks and as well at the state level. So a core network plays particular roles for the movement network as a whole. And I want to talk a little bit about what that is and break that out. So the core network has a coordination role. And in that, the core network members are ensuring that the kind of collaborative infrastructure is maintained for information to flow across the movement network. Member networks need to have coordination capacity and resources, so the core network is helping to oversee that. And the core network, very importantly, is taking care to see that the full system is convened for member networks to curate learning and share promising practices. So that's a network-wide role. Another aspect of the core network's role is an advocacy role within the larger system. So being kind of the voice for the movement network as a whole. And with that role, core network members are tracking progress and telling stories about what's happening across the networks. Early on, they're advocating particularly for the removal of constraints. So what is in the way that we can remove that will help us do our work better? Later, this becomes putting in place new things that have been generated through the movement networks. So practices, policies at the regional and state level that help to support the environment that we believe will help us be successful in our work. And then there are members of the movement network who are playing a diplomatic role, and they're kind of buffering the innovation space that allows the network mindset to flourish because it's different than what's been done before and people have questions. So there's a role for champions within the movement network to help other people see and be comfortable with the kind of experiment that is attempting to take root here. So this is what a movement network would look like when it's fully operational. But we also want to show you a picture of what we imagine that the movement network would look like as we cultivate a core network with the ELCP. So the movement network doesn't happen all at once. It takes time to cultivate those relationships. So the first priority is to cultivate a healthy, effective core network. So this image reflects our current best thinking about what your core network and nascent movement network of implementers would look like if you mapped it out for maybe the year of 2023. So at the center, we have your coordination team in blue, and these folks are more or less the paid staff of the network, supporting and making it easy for everyone to participate. The core network, and those little dots are the people. This is the center in orange. And within the core network are teams devoted to key activities of the network. And so these are the things that you aspire to do based on your plan. And this is where the work of the core network happens. The implementers are in purple, and these are all of your partners implementing the coordination plan, and they're your future movement network participants. The simple difference being that they aren't yet organized into local networks and coordinated. So I want to point out the network development team as one of the teams, and they will help steward the core network as a whole. So we envision this helps to tee up proposals for the whole of the core network based on their participation and listening of the network as a whole. And they're playing a kind of larger coordination function in tandem with the coordination team inside the core network. So I'm going to pause there and say, with this, where we hope we're going is into something that looks like this murmuration of starlings, where the process of becoming something other than, greater than the sum of the parts is what we start to see.